So, shall I start?
I'm going to
Yes,
introduce you,
please start.
Francis, before you start. So I'm really excited to be chairing tonight's talk. And tonight we have Francis Maude, who's going to talk about one of the heritage projects across the Commonwealth. Francis is an architect and conservation specialist, and he is the chair of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum. And his many projects have included the Palace at Westminster and the Temperate House at Kew, both World Heritage Sites, as well as the Parliament and President's House in Trinidad, the J Villas Palace in Gwalior, India, and the City Hall in Georgetown, Guyana. So we will hand over to Francis in a moment. There will be an opportunity for attendees to ask questions at the end. These can be put in the chat, or we can do them at the end by unmuting, and you can ask them. But first of all, we will find out more from Francis about the project that he's going to be talking through this evening. So, Francis, I hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Louise. I hope everyone can see the first slide, which shows an aerial view of Georgetown in Guyana. Can you all see that? Brilliant. I will proceed. This has been a really fascinating project, and it's been lovely to have been involved in various projects in Guyana for about 10 years now. It's about 10 years indeed since we first started looking at the City Hall, which is actually this building. I hope you can see the mouse just near the top of the screen. Following that project, which we were invited to undertake by the National Trust of Guyana, we were then, a few years later, approached again to look at a rather larger and wider project to investigate the urban composition of two of the city centre wards within Georgetown, with a view to developing and then establishing a series of planning guidelines which might then be rolled out across the other parts of the city. Now, the reason for this, of course, is that presently Guyana has one of the fastest growing economies in the world following the discovery of oil off the coast. But it also has, within the city centre, a great treasure trove of historic buildings, mostly built in timber and dating back to the mid-19th century, and some of them are older than that, but the majority of them are mid-19th century onwards, laid out on a grid pattern within the confines of what was originally a colony for the production of sugar. And the first part of the talk will go through a little bit about the development of the city centre, and then I'll explain a bit more about the project itself. But while we have the slide here, it's going to prompt me to remember the various collaborators who we had within the project. Again, the National Trust for Guyana, particularly led by Nirvana Persad, as well as the King's Foundation, the Office of the President, whose house is actually more or less centre of the screen. It's about here. This is his house. And the University of Guyana too, where we were very ably assisted by Dr. Anna Pereira and three of her students, who we were very pleased to include in the project as part of the ability to, as it were, transfer knowledge, which can then become part of the next generation's approach to looking after what is in many ways still an extremely beautiful city. So I will move on to the next slide when I have persuaded the system to do so. Our brief essentially was the preparation of a conservation management plan, or more accurately in this particular case, a conservation area management plan, because part of what we were seeking to do was to devise and to present policies for the areas of the two city centre wards of Kingstown and Commingsburg. So this sets out the sort of contents page from the resulting report that we prepared, and is actually a useful vehicle for explaining what we're going to be discussing as I continue to talk. We have effectively a summary of what we have done at the beginning of the document, and then there's a discussion of the historical background and the development of Georgetown itself, an assessment of its significance. Then there are a number of issues arise for how the city can be maintained and indeed improved, and suggestions as to how they can be resolved. We also included a section on costs and budgets for some of the more necessary elements and projects arising from it, and then a discussion as to how it was going to be implemented, and that was completed with a gazetteer which effectively described all of the various streets throughout the main city centre area within which we were involved. So, Georgetown, a a relatively modern city. It was created a city, I think, in the year 1837, and it was then named Georgetown, which was part of the original nucleus of the town. But before that, it was really a port at the mouth of the Demerara River, and sugar plantations were the most known feature. And Demerara sugar, even today, speaks to many people as an essential cooking ingredient, and you can buy it in your local grocery store. So it was really a port city to connect the European colonizers, originally the Dutch, in fact, with this coast, which is in fact extremely flat and has been drained as a result of the construction of drainage canals, to enable the soil then to be used for growing sugar and then a variety of other tropical crops as well. We'll touch also on the status of the city as a garden city with the large Amazonica water lilies, which are illustrated in the second shot from less than the wide planted streets, the way in which the city was developed on a grid, and a few notes about its architectural heritage and character. So, the port city, here we are at the mouth of the River Demerara. It projects a little further into the sea, the banks that is, on the eastern side than on the western side. You can see a ship rounding the point. And the lighthouse, which you see illustrated, still stands today. It's about 140 feet tall from memory, constructed in brick, London stock brick, in fact, and is probably the only surviving structure within this image, which is still there. You can climb up to the top of it. It's no longer functioning as a lighthouse. Various programs of embankment and reclaimment have moved the edge of the shore a little bit further out, so it's now a redundant structure. The purpose of the London stock brick, it was firstly to enable a separation between the very damp ground conditions, which being at or below sea level is very necessary, and also to provide something which can be brought back from Europe. And stock bricks are quite often known, in fact, as ballast bricks, because they are brought back as ballast from London in order to fill up the ship's holds once they deposit their cargo of sugar in Europe. I should just mention, having said that Guyana was originally a Dutch colony, it changed hands during the Napoleonic Wars. It was briefly French, and from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it has been a British colony and remained such until 1966. When independence was achieved. So, to continue, here is an illustration showing on the left one of the early forts defending the mouth of the river. There was a battery in place on that location, and you can match that with the 1921 early aerial photograph, and you can see how the shape here, with this curve going round and the drainage ponds on, relates very much to this shape just here. And there's a series of streets going along the bank. There's this street here, which is actually very important, which is Water Street. It's the street closest to the water in the river. There are a series of warehouses going down to landing stages known as stellings, because that was the original Dutch term for them, and a general arrangement of other buildings too in a set of more or less parallel streets forming a grid. You'll also note just in this location here, the remains of the railway station works right on the harbour frontage, and which then threaded out in this direction towards the outer suburbs of the town. And they would be used largely, in fact, to bring the produce from the coastal strip where most agriculture took place to the landing stages. So, early development of Georgetown, you can see how the land has been divided up into a number of plots. Originally, as I mentioned, for the purposes of growing sugar. This 1828 map shows Georgetown, the developed area itself, which is partly represented on the top corner here by the fort that we saw, and a limited amount of development around. The plots themselves, which I know will be difficult to read at this scale, have names which even today relate to the various residential and other suburbs that there are going out from the historic core. Rumvelt, for instance, Vlissingen is now reflected in the name of a road, and so on and so forth, going out further into the countryside. To drain the land, a number of canals were dug of varying widths. There are two particularly large ones, which are also part of the water supply system for the city of Georgetown, one of which is illustrated here, and you can see marked on this left-hand map the construction of two larger canals, This is the Commonwealth Canal, which defines one of the two suburbs, or wards, which we were asked to describe. And the other one is the Lamahar one, along which the railway line subsequently was constructed. But you can see that they're wide and grand spaces, tropically planted, roads on both sides, buildings set within large plots. And of course, a key feature of the hot and humid climate is the need to promote open buildings which can then attract breezes to maintain a more moderate and agreeable climate within them. So that's part of the logic behind the arrangement of the city. There are a series of development plans which I was able to obtain from the National Trust during the earlier project for the City Hall. You can see that the Demerara River is but one of many rivers which flow into the sea through Guyana, and in fact Guyana itself is translated to mean the land of many rivers. There's the Essequibo River, which is much larger, which is a little bit further west, and in the mouth of which are a number of islands, and they were easily defendable as initial settlement points during the first period of Dutch settlement. You see here there's the fort, which I showed a picture of earlier, and the beginnings of a grid of streets from the late 18th century, extending further into the early, mid 19th century. And population figures are appended as well. You can see how the city has grown during the period of up till 2001. And there are now plans, of course, to expand the city further, part of which was the reason for our study and our appointment in order to look at what might be policies to control, manage, better arrange the development of the city. So here again, there's been a certain amount of academic research done into the transformation of the city from plantation areas, and you can see late 18th century list here of names, and a lot of the owners by this stage were British, but the names of many, or some at least, of the plots that they owned were still Dutch or indeed French from the shorter French period. There was colonisation also and development of plantation plots on the west bank of the Demerara River, and there were always ferries shuttling to and fro across the mouth of the river. And on the right-hand side, you can see how the plots started to be developed. You can even see how trees are illustrated on this, because beyond it being a sugar plantation, cash crops included cocoa and coffee, later on rice, and indeed now there's a certain amount of aquaculture as well, which is to say growing prawns in flooded parts of the land. You'll also see that there's a large area here which is sort of mud flats, and they've progressively been reclaimed. The shoreline is now effectively sort of somewhere out here. Water Street, which I mentioned before, runs along here. This is the wide canal that I mentioned too. So we can see how the nucleus of the city is being brought from the layouts of the initial plantations, how the plantations were then drained through the backbreaking work from enslaved people, brought to the coast and then made to work to create the plantations, and which then formed the nucleus of the city blocks when they were subdivided to accommodate housing later on. Moving on again, 1823, it's the Commonwealth Canal, there's the Lamahar Canal a bit further south. Water Street appears again. The High Street runs behind that, and then Account Street. And you'll also spot just here in the middle an area of open ground, which has been quite important as a parade ground, as an essential part of the development of the city. And it's reflected in a series of subsequent maps in 1847, and then towards the end of the 19th century, we see the same plots here in this close-up showing the Commonwealth ward area, the railway station, the railway line coming in along the Lamahar Canal, the grid layout into large residential plots, the State House in which dwells the President, just here, which I showed from the air. This is the parade ground, this bit, and then the promenade gardens, which are next to it. And there's a series of broad avenues running north to south, and they have central canals to them as part of the water management system and the greening of the city, which I outlined earlier on. And here are some photographs showing it. The High Street, you can see by this stage they've narrowed the central canal within it, unfortunately at the same time as offering to form part of the water supply and the water drainage system. It was also rather a haven for mosquitoes and tended to fill itself in with silt. So you can see how that's looking at that time. But you also see a very calm kind of city scape here. This is the high street looking north towards the sea. There's the timber frame buildings with the Demerara shutters, which prevented direct sunlight but permitted breezes at the same time. There's the wide awnings at street level to shade the various businesses and open rooms at that level, and the wide-spaced buildings making quite a generously planned and open city. And then maybe a little bit later, this photograph, which shows actually on the left the construction of the law courts. They would be new at that time. And quite recently, they discovered a statue of Queen Victoria, which had previously been thought to be lost. She's missing her nose and part of one arm, but it has been reinstated on the main western front of the law courts. This is actually looking towards the east along Crowell Street. And behind us is the sea, extensive electricity and telegraph supplies at this point. And then another one of the set of 1921 photographs, which we looked at earlier. This again shows the grid pattern of the city and the relaxed and enjoyable surroundings which it offers through wide north-south avenues with shady trees, the promenade gardens, the parade ground, slightly narrower cross streets, and then within those the plots are divided up by a series of smaller drainage things, and you can see greater and lesser degrees of development within each of the individual plot as far back as 105 years ago. And so here we are, further development, looking at increasing construction of warehouses and other structures along the main Water Street frontage. It's now essentially an inland street. It's not open to the water on one side any longer by the time this is done. But you see also the characteristic size of buildings, the materials from which they're constructed, essentially timber frame, externally clad in weatherboarding, internally lined perhaps with a second layer of boards, sash windows, Demerara shutters, corrugated iron roofs, large catchment areas, and where the warehouses are, of course, they're rather closer together in this industrial part of the city. You get a better sense, perhaps, from near street level in this view along Water Street, from a little bit further back, where it swaps the other way. We're looking south on this occasion towards the main market building. This is the tower for it just here. They had trams at that stage. Some of the buildings were quite large, and of course, large timber frame buildings are sadly rather prone to catch fire, and that has been a repeated event within the city's history. The most recent large fire was in about 1945, 1948, following which there was a central area of the city which was reconstructed in a modernist style. Many of the buildings still survive. Perhaps bottom left is a photograph which best shows the kind of the garden city nature of Georgetown at this date. Again, another late 19th century photograph showing the varying arrangements of houses, the streets, the trees, and so on. Effectively, a kind of a relaxed and pleasant city in which to live. And the drawing here, which shows the government house, which still stands, now known as the State House, and as formerly mentioned, the home of the president. And you'll also see on this particular drawing, because it was before corrugated iron was widespread, the use of roofing slates. Quite often they were imported at the same time as the ballast bricks, which formed the lower part of the structure. And looking at this, in fact, is quite helpful to be able to see sort of the structural layout of many of the buildings. We've tended to have either an open ground floor or raised up ground floor in many of the principal residences. These would be constructed of London bricks, open spaces which could be enclosed for various businesses purposes. But the main rooms, the important spaces, are all up on the first floor, which can be constructed fully out of timber. There'll be a second story on top of that. And in many houses, in fact, they had towers added to them. And it was always claimed in myth that these towers were intended so that when people went out to sea, other members of the family could climb to the top of the tower and look out and see at which point their family and friends' ship might be returning, and so they'd be able to catch sight of them, know when the ship was coming, and hasten to the harbour side in order to greet them. So that's been a brief history of the city, and I'll now just go through what our project involved in terms of undertaking an assessment of what remains of the city today. Our study area is shown on this plan, slightly skewed, but north is sort of directed towards the top end here. This is north-south, this is east-west. Useful aerial view. The Lamahar Canal here brings us down to this point, which I mentioned before, as well. There's the former railway station, and there's actually a Transport and Harbour Department works, which still survives to the day in this point here. This part to the south of the canal is Commingsburg. The other part is Kingston, and it contains many buildings of the types which I've described, plus others besides. And you can still see that at the time of this photograph, an active harbour frontage, though equally some parts are now much less active than they were previously. Just in this location here is the rather wonderfully named Molasses Wharf, where you've got enormous drums, rather like gasometers, or the things which they have at gas refineries, which are entirely full of molasses, which is quite extraordinary to see, and rather sort of warm smell that you have if you're nearby. We walked the streets across the area of our study in order to be able to effectively assess the significance of the surviving structures, which we looked at in terms of their originality, in terms of date or other architectural significance, and we were provided with a list as to structures which are effectively considered locally important. And there are others which are effectively a useful part of a streetscape. They're not notable buildings in themselves, but by contributing to a setting as a whole, we have a clear sense of how we can create or we can reinforce a sense of kind of a uniform environment within a street by having something which contributes to the general setting. There are others which are kind of modern day buildings of an essential need, but no particular architectural merit, so we call those neutral. And there have been some other, sadly, more regrettable developments in terms of scale, or possibly sometimes just simply in terms of condition, which, in the interests of having a more, I guess, architecturally coherent and more enjoyable space, it's either their use or sometimes their scale and massing, which caused us to consider that some structures were detrimental to their setting. We then assessed, with the help of the University of Guyana students, the construction period of the buildings across our site, and you can see how we've coloured them up. Essentially, we've got a number of 19th century buildings. We've got, I don't quite know why the scale is sort of not put in chronological order, but we've basically got the first third, middle third, and last third 20th century buildings in the blue, the green, and the brown. We've got red for surviving 19th century structures, and a number of modern ones which date to the 21st century, and they are highlighted as well. Be they hotels or other modern interventions. But we can see that there's a clear grouping and dominance, really, of 20th century buildings, with in some areas, particularly around here and around here, the State House area, a significant number of 19th century buildings. In others, there's a kind of a range of more modern warehouse and industrial structures, not all of which are in good condition. So they kind of help us to understand what's happening. It may also just be useful, I think it's on the next slide, let's just see, to look at the condition of the various buildings. That's been monitored as well. Some are in good condition, particularly those in government ownership, which is largely up in this quarter, which contains army and police training barracks, a hospital, also the more modern hospitality buildings, a number of hotels up here. We ended up calling this the hospitality quarter. Equally, there are a number of buildings which are in much poorer condition down towards this side of the site. We weren't able to get into the middle of the plots to look at all of the buildings, but if I say that essentially in this area, there are a large number of buildings in poor or derelict condition, and which therefore, in that regard, presented the opportunity for further development. Construction type was also considered, the main materials being either timber or timber mixed, because it would be on top of a masonry or brick frame. A lot of the more modern structures have been built in concrete or even with steel. Again, we looked at that in order to kind of understand the texture of the city as a whole, and therefore how its character could be defined and considered. Use is also marked up on a series of plans. This is an incomplete version, but essentially it illustrates how some buildings and some districts, in fact, are more commercial, others are more residential.
Hi, good morning. Fine, thank you. How are you?
And others again have industrial uses, particularly along this area here, by Water Street, which is at the bottom of the plan as you see it. As a result of this, we were able to identify a number of opportunity sites across Georgetown in our 2 wards of Kingstown and Cummingsburg, and these are marked here. Some of these are essentially vacant plots, or plots where the buildings have become derelict, and they often relate, in fact, to areas quite near the centre of town, particularly in this area here, where there have been a number of businesses which are no longer viable, or there have been building projects which were started and not completed, and they kind of create opportunities for significant additional development in this particular zone, which, as I say, is quite near the main street, which is here. Water Street is down here, and that defines actually a more interesting opportunity for a longer term development. Some of the docks remain in use. One of them contains an ice factory for the creation of ice, for those who don't have refrigeration. There are things like power stations up towards this end, and it's intended they should go. The molasses terminal is approximately here. And it would seem that there's an opportunity over an extended period of, let's say, 20 years, gradually to be able to acquire the sites which are no longer in any form of commercial use, and to take them as being opportunities for redevelopment, which would deliver a number of benefits to the city. And we will look at those soon. Here we are. The outcome of our analysis also included the identification of sort of key themes or key elements within the centre of the city. Industrial Georgetown along the river can easily be explained because I've already alluded to the various items that are along here. We remember also that the shoreline originally was much closer to Water Street than it is today. Hospitality Georgetown, I mentioned as well. The main hotels are all up here and are then connected to other elements of historic Georgetown down these streets, particularly this one, which forms a major avenue for pedestrians and has a central market stalls from time to time. Ceremonial Georgetown includes the cathedral, which is just outside our site, and at the time of its construction, and indeed until very recently, was the tallest, also we understood it, the tallest timber structure in the world. It's about 147, I think, feet high. That's about 50 odd meters, and constructed entirely in timber above the usual brick substructure. Commingsburg Street is on here, Carmichael Street is along here, and leads to the State House, the President's House, as I mentioned, in this location here. The National Trust for Guyana's headquarters are somewhere close by. There's the Parade Ground, which is a sports field, what can be used for praise, and there's the Promenade Gardens here, which actually includes a number of other things too, and one of the most recent and interesting was the funeral, actually, of Sonny Rampal, who was Guyanese and for a long time was the head of the Commonwealth Secretariat, and he came home and has been laid to rest in this location here. Residential is the main theme in this part here, and then there's the military and police training barracks, which I also mentioned earlier. One other thing, and which immediately came to us as an opportunity to be investigated further and form part of the way in which the site would link to the rest of Georgetown and to plans which are being developed by others, including the King's Foundation and the President's Office for additional suburbs and new areas, was this greenway, which flows along the line of the Lamaha Canal and originally formed the track bed of the railway system. The main central station was just here at the top of Carmichael Street, but the Transport and Harbour Department repair works were just down here. So essentially we've got this line, a few buildings on it, empty from literally here onwards, the whole way, going out of town, paved. You can use it as a cycle track already, you can walk along it as a pedestrian route, and that presents us with a really, really good opportunity to be able to link the centre of Georgetown once more to the surrounding countryside in a green and sustainable fashion. So that was one of the things which informed our decisions about how we could look at the city next. Here, we've just shown a number of the key buildings within the site, the cathedral, the State House. These are the key listed structures. There was formerly a railway station, but it's been much curtailed and reduced to just one thing here. The Transport and Harbour Department works, the Molasses Wharf, the ice factory, and some of the commercial buildings are actually interesting in their own right. Down here, there are a number of buildings which followed the mid-20th century fire, and which were rebuilt here in a modernist style, which was featured in the journal Building and the Architectural Design Press at the period. This is the Carnegie Library, one of many sponsored by Carnegie throughout the world. This is a school building, and then there are other important residential structures located in other streets near the centre of town as well. And what this is intended to show through the green line that we've also added is how we could construct a walking route which took us past the interesting features of the town, starting actually from the Hotel the Marriott, as the hotel just in this location. One could in future consider going down Water Street. The lighthouse is just here. The other structures are this way. We go down to the middle of town, we can look at the main sites, and we can make our way back again in a continuous loop, which then would link to other ways of travelling elsewhere. So taking this further, we then started to look at renewal areas within Georgetown, which would provide opportunities to increase the assets and the potentialities which are already there. There is a seawall which effectively prevents the whole of the city from becoming flooded. And this place here, there has been a lot of work done in recent years, but there are further opportunities which we think it is worth bearing in mind to connect this seawall beautification area to the rest of the city, not least through the Riverside Renewal Area and, of course, to the Greenway itself mentioned before. So we prepared this outline sketch, which is an aerial view. Water Street is along here. We've highlighted a few of the main buildings. There's the State House, which is just here, the Promenade Gardens, the Parade Ground, the cathedral is at the top here. The ice factory is somewhere. Here's the ice factory. The molasses wharf is in the foreground here. But taking the area as a whole, we think there's a way in which we can rebuild something which takes advantage of opportunities for natural ventilation, for shading, for the kind of built fabric of the city, and on a scale up to about 4 stories high, maybe about 15 meters or so, which is going to resonate with the existing development of the city. It will provide a lot of additional accommodation, which could be a combination of commercial, residential, live-work units, and so on. And we also identified the opportunity to link the Greenway, which is along here, through to a coastal route which links up with the end of what we've shown in this previous slide. The view is taken, by the way, from about here, looking across the city centre. But if we could create a link which took us around here and then links all these other things together, then we felt that would be a significant benefit in the way in which the sustainable future of Georgetown could be managed. And so here is a very quick sketch showing Water Street with some imaginary new buildings on the right-hand side and some existing ones on the left. This, in fact, is the Transport and Harbour Department. Works appear to have been constructed late 19th, early 20th century. There's a lot of interesting historical machinery within there, and as I say, it is still in use. The buildings themselves are not in especially brilliant condition at the moment, but capable in most cases of being saved. But the thing which struck us here was that the preservation of so much industrial equipment in such a key location prompted the possibility of a museum use for this range of buildings, and developed from that and from further subsequent conversations. There is a desire to consider expanding the footprint of these buildings by constructing something adjacent, which would serve as a new national museum for Guyana to complement and perhaps to replace the existing museum, which was constructed post the 1945 fire near the centre of town. And this, of course, is on the pedestrian route, which we've highlighted already, which is parallel to Water Street, which is the street in the foreground. So we can sort of see how it all starts to link together to create something which would work coherently to effectively make the city more like it is already. And just one thing to note on the right-hand side, you've got these sluices punctuating the river side where you go from inland into the sea or into a tidal river, and they're controlled so that when the tide is out, the sluice gates go up, the water can flow away. When it starts to come in again, it goes back down, and the water then drains out of the land, fills the drainage canal back up again to be released next time it's low tide. It's been a system which they've had in place for a long time and forms part of the essential way for water management throughout the city and throughout the country. So we're now going to take a closer look at the streets and talk a little bit about those and the kind of form that they have. So we've got two key forms of street. We've got the main north-south avenues, which are in red on this plan, and the cross streets, which are in brown, which are narrower. They both contain a wide mix of buildings. And certainly within Commingsburg, at the bottom, the north-south streets, the main avenues, as it were, are more prominent and more clearly defined. They don't necessarily link through into the Kingston area, which is at the top here, and the streets and the roads in it tend, in most cases, to be narrower. There is, of course, a wider avenue at the top here, but here we're getting into the hospitality area once more. So that's the kind of the general partie of how the streets operate within this part of the town centre. And we then took two typical streets within each of these areas, essentially a main avenue and a cross street, in order to be able to consider streetscape improvements, which could be then expanded to a wider scale, and in the context of the 19th century and more modern buildings within the streets themselves. So this is Barrack Street, which is up towards the top of the plan. You can see a combination of 19th century and later buildings. This type of construction probably went on until round about the mid-20th century, being superseded probably from the 1950s onwards with more concrete frame-type structures. And it's not always easy to date these buildings. Sometimes they've been given new facades, sometimes they've been essentially constructed in the same manner as the older structures, but they create, as we can see here, a kind of a harmonious environment, but there are a number of things which we felt it would be helpful to address, particularly the absence of pavements, lots of cars being parked in convenient locations, high-level services, wires and stuff, which are quite visually obtrusive, but it's part of the kind of the historic development of the city. And here is how we started to think about ways in which we could make the streetscapes work better, partly by looking at how the drainage works. They have drainage canals on either side. We've got the dimensions for them there. Partly by thinking about whether end-on car parking would reduce the length of the street needed to park cars, and therefore whether, as here, here, and here, there would then be some space left for the planting of trees along the streets at the same time. How we could include enough space for people to walk along, and so on and so forth, as part of the general way in which it might work. And here is how we felt it might be possible to do some of those things. We weren't able to resolve all of it. The complications of putting all the services below ground, I think, are probably beyond our current brief. But given the opportunity there and the need for pavements, we felt something of the kind that we're showing here: improved street lighting, wider pavements so you can make around tactile paving to indicate sensible places to cross, maybe bringing the cars a little bit closer to the building line, and perhaps using, or by covering over, the narrow drains that there are alongside each road, could offer partial or perhaps more complete solutions to many of these particular points. And you can see examples of the kinds of materials, the kinds of tactile paving at which we were considering. And so, based on the previous photograph, I've kind of marked up some of the changes that we'd want to retain the trees, we want to retain and redecorate the historic buildings, consistent street lighting, rationalize the power and IT cables, how we can perhaps limit the amount of street parking, have dropped curbs at entry points, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry this isn't an especially good reproduction of the original drawing, but I think it conveys the general ideas that we've been seeking to put forward. We also looked at Carmichael Street, which is the street that leads past the National Trust of Guyana's offices and past the State House to and then towards the Promenade Gardens. So it's a kind of a key part of the city centre. The drainage ditches have almost become entirely choked with weed by this stage, so that's another thing to consider. So there is in fact a bridge which you can't see concealed at this point here. You see the cathedral at the bottom of the street, very impressive piece of work, designed by, thinking really hard here, Blomfield. It was a Blomfield building. I don't think he ever visited site. A wide opportunity for trees, some of which are still there, and some other parts of comparable streets do have a wider number of trees than this does. But you will again see random parking just along the verges in much the same way as before, but there is, in this case, along what was the centre of a wider open canal. Originally, the canal would have spanned from here across to this side here, so the infill and put this central walkway down there. That does remain a safe place for pedestrians. So an analysis of what we're seeing at the moment: cars parked, the central walking space, the cables, and a few more photographs illustrating what there is at the moment, including the insufficient litter bin activity to be able to maintain tidy streets. We've got the ditches, as mentioned before. We can't actually even see how deep they are because of the weeds that have grown within them. And here are some of the design items which form the proposals for improving the streetscape here. Bridges in a number of places across the canals. We think we can rationalise car parking again by effectively using the kind of tactile grid surfaces through which grass can grow, so that we have less dust, at the same time as maintaining sufficient areas for rainwater drainage, make better social spaces, particularly in the middle, clean out and green the drainage canals, the swales, which go to permeable paving I've mentioned. So that's kind of how we could conceive of a number of improvements to create something which is perhaps a bit more like this in terms of its final appearance. And here is a sort of a multi-layered sketch approximating to showing some of the same things. I mean, the trees have been partly removed from the sketch to make it possible to see other things going on as well. But improved crossings, improved lighting bollards and things of that kind. The bridges revealed, the open water within the canals there, and so on, plus the increased tree canopy, are parts of the general approach to addressing these various matters that we feel would make it a more agreeable place to be a pedestrian or to be a cyclist, and make the city itself a greener place. And so here are areas of the city where similar things are already in place. This, in fact, is the main street, the high street here, which has got a market in progress at the time this picture was taken. Others have lesser traffic and cars parked more freely. That again, and you can see here the swale, which is embanked in this particular case, enabling it to remain open. So we want to kind of pick up some of those ideas and actually kind of bring them back more universally into the parts of the city which we're wanting to improve. Just a brief summary here of some of the kind of building types and what we meant when we were talking about the kinds of building which are important and interesting. There's some kind of prestige buildings like this one here, which is the residence of the Anglican Archbishop in the middle of the city. This is a nonconformist church, mid-20th century modernism. We actually find buildings like that quite attractive in terms of the way in which they just quietly form part of the streetscape. They are kind of integrate with the rest of the street in terms of scale, at the same time as being representative of their own age at the time they're constructed. And this earlier 20th century bookshop is another such example. Not all the historic buildings in equally good condition, as is demonstrated here, but nevertheless it's still loved by its owners, and it's a great asset to be able to kind of see things like that. You've got the open ground floor described earlier, you've got the main living spaces upstairs. And you'll see it's quite reticent, but well fitting in 20th century structures in terms of the way in which they use the same materials, the same massing. Perhaps a more shallow roof pitch is the one thing which I might want to consider, but they nevertheless form part of a continuum of urban environment by maintaining a similar kind of density of plot development in many cases as was there before. And once more, you've kind of got the masonry at low level and the timber structure above that in both those cases. We have seen some more aggressive modern developments, typified top left, as well as some joyous celebrations of colour. Here, I think this was Fort Street, this particular image was taken. Not necessarily everything needs to be white. There's been a consistency, or at least an overwhelming preponderance of the use of many materials. It's the timber, as sort of seen in some of the earlier examples. And we've also kind of seen some more modern developments which have altered, in some respects, the character of the buildings, often in a quest to maximise the use of space. What might once have been an open veranda to catch the breeze has been enclosed to gain additional living space. And equally, there have been some additions which alter the character of the building entirely, such as this plain glass facade which has been added onto the front of what was otherwise a perfectly well-conceived and neutral part of a streetscape. Bottom building is actually quite an interesting one. It's 3 stories high. It's on Camp Street, so it's towards the eastern end of our site. And it's the quarters of the Demerara Bank. And it's intended to be entirely self-sufficient in its energy. It has a number of solar panels on the roof. It has a large battery store in the basement.
Sorry, that was my bad.
Which can therefore provide the full energy needs of the building through careful monitoring and gathering the power when it's sunny and keeping it for use to run the air conditioning, the computer, the lighting, the other systems. Slightly black box inside in many of the spaces, but I didn't go into every room, so perhaps beyond the main sort of auditorium meeting room spaces that there's a better way to see out. But an interesting structure nonetheless, and worthwhile in terms of how it can show the opportunity to improve other buildings, perhaps historically constructed buildings, in a way that will make them more sustainable at the same time. So, how much longer have I got?
About
Got 10 minutes. Yeah, sorry.
We've got
Go ahead.
Okay, another 10 minutes. Okay.
Well, Francis, we've got quite a lot of questions, so I'd suggest maybe wrap up in about 5.
Okay, no, that's good. Let's do that. We'll just talk now about one of the kind of the project areas that we highlighted, and that is the Transport and Harbour Department work. So just have a quick look at that. This is looking at it from the street. These are the gable buildings that we saw in one of the earlier pictures. In fact, these are our student collaborators. Good to see them included in some of the pictures. There's kind of an office building. There's a store building, which is in particularly poor condition. And I fear that may have been lost, actually. There's the remains of the last railway carriage from the railway system, which closed down in 1970 on site as well. Lots of machinery, as I mentioned before, in various states of use. Some of it is, say, very much in use. And so our proposal, which we've kind of marked up, we've done an outline measured survey that we've got a good set of floor plans of them, and we've highlighted the various areas of the buildings that there are on this part of the site, so what they're used for is explained here, and there are opportunities for building conservation of the existing structures, as also with the historic machinery, including, for instance, this bandsaw for planing timber, and other machines, metal workshops, forges, etc. The opportunities actually to use all of these as a training location for the craft skills that were necessary to restore not just these buildings, but others throughout the centre of Georgetown at the same time. So it's kind of both a museum and a training opportunity, and it's relatively close by to the current location of the Technical College in the centre of Georgetown. So we think there's an opportunity to create a kind of collective approach to resolving the future use of these things in a way that's beneficial to the largest number of people. As you can see, not all in brilliant condition. On the right-hand side, there's the remains of the railway train. And so we put together a proposal for the museum, which included various activities that could take place within each one, display some of the things that are happening at the moment in the forge area, the workshops, the railway line goes through, the railway carriage is parked about here, and so on. And it gives opportunities for more things too, physical exhibition spaces, craft training, as well as the shop, the cafe, the group areas for school parties, and so on. So we did a few sketches showing what some of the bits might look like and how the existing structures could be reused. And you'll see that this is actually the same view as that photograph on the left just there. It's amazing what clearing away the debris does. And you've seen this view before, but this is the outside, just looking at it from a streetscape point of view. So I think we might just about have got to the end. This is just kind of the conclusions of all the things we've been working about. This is the circled area showing our sample project. Carmichael Street, mentioned before, is this street. Barrack Street is across here. And that, I think, more or less gets us to the end of the things that we most wanted to cover. Yes, we stop here. So that was, I think, less than 5 minutes. So there are time for the questions, which I'll try to answer as many of as possible.
Fascinating. That's amazing. Thank you, Francis. I'm sorry, there's a bit of noise in the background as my family are just celebrating a goal that's just been scored in a football match. So I apologise for that.
Okay. Right.
So you've got
Mm,
questions in the chat. So I just
yeah,
wonder if we sort of start at the top and work our way down.
yeah,
Can
yeah.
you see? Do you want to stop sharing your screen? Then we'll be able to see you.
I could stop staying my screen. Let's do that. Here we go. Let's stop sharing.
Great. Great. And then our first question is from Peregrine about the impact termites and other timber boring insects have had on the timber buildings.
Uh, yes, termites have had an impact on the buildings. They are all vulnerable to a greater or lesser degree. There are various techniques, both in the terms of construction, which can help protect them, and in additional treatments later on. Though not all of them are necessarily safe to use in a domestic context. But as we found with many things, one of the keys to preventing decay is to keep everything as dry as possible by preventing water ingress. I don't think there's kind of a one-size-fits-all solution to this, but yes, it is something which we see the consequences of in many of the structures that we look at.
Great, thank you. And then we've got a series of questions which are broadly around risk and also about climate change as well. So, a question about fire, flooding, and rotting risks.
Okay, what's the actual question? I mean, because there's
It's
historically
the
been a fire
follow
risk.
on. So, it is what's the impact of fire, flooding, rotting on the timber constructed buildings?
Okay, fire, yes, parts of the building have been vulnerable and indeed have continued to be so. At one time, there was a sorry, when I say yes, in terms of a fire, so there was the 1945 fire, which led to an area of the centre of the city being damaged. There was early 21st century, there was consideration given to whether it would be possible to list the centre of Georgetown as a World Heritage Site due to the collection of historic timber buildings, such as the cathedral, which we've seen in the back of some of the pictures, the State House, and a number of other structures too. And there was a large and interesting church, the Church of the Sacred Heart. Was a Catholic church, which sadly burnt down, I think, in 2004. And that raised a lot of people's concerns about what could be done to prevent individual buildings catching fire and how could they be protected more thoroughly. And so, as part of the restoration of the City Hall project, we did look into particular tactics that could be used with individual buildings. And obviously, we need to look after the protection of life first. So additional means of escape where they're previously not enough, but also the need to use chemicals which reduce the combustibility of timber. There are surface applied treatments, which, for instance, can prevent the surface spread of flame or can upgrade timber partitions in particular, which may be made out of boards of, let's say, 25, 30 millimeters thick, so that they don't catch fire so quickly. And when they do catch fire, they provide a much better level of insulation so that the fire can't so rapidly transmit itself from one location to another. So yes, we are taking advantage of modern techniques to do that. You mentioned also rot, and part of that is keeping the timber dry. As someone in the chat has also reminded me, Green Heart is very proof against many forms of decay as well as termite infestation, which is why Green Heart timbers have long been imported to the UK for use as railway sleepers. So yes, there are timbers which have a much better resistance. And another one which does is actually Douglas pitch pine, which has a higher resin content, which is unappetizing to termites. So they aren't perfect, but they are a lot better in being able to resist this kind of thing. And of course, as I mentioned right back at the beginning of the talk, there's always been a separation between the damp ground and the actual timber structure through the use of ground level structures made out of ballast bricks or now concrete.
Great, thank you, Francis. I think that answers a group of questions there.
Mm.
And then I'm going to paraphrase some of the questions there, which are around public participation and community involvement within the project. And I just wonder, responding to Nicholas's question, but also Melinda's question around the sort of public engagement and how you sort of have done that through the project.
Yes, what we did was based upon a number of things, and this is where the engagement with the students at the University of Guyana is very helpful, in that at the same time as assisting us with this particular project, they were undertaking a survey to discuss with a number of local residents, and I can't say that it was sort of necessarily a fully fledged online survey with hundreds of respondents, but nevertheless, one of the key things, it was really important to understand what motivations people had to protect and live in a historic building, which required a higher degree of maintenance than a more modern one might do, because as an alternative to buying a timber-framed 19th or early 20th century house in the centre of Georgetown, you could go and buy something made out of blockwork with modern materials and insulation and so on, air conditioning, in one of the suburbs. And it came down to, firstly, a desire to live in a particular location. Secondly, of course, an engagement with actually the joy of living in a more historic environment. They felt that people had lived in the house for 100 years, and they liked that, and they were quite prepared to accept that there would be other compromises to be made. One other study, which I didn't refer to in the discussion, was to look at how the buildings themselves could be made more comfortable and more usable. One of the key things is that most of the buildings have sort of closed interiors with the air condition going pretty much all of the time. They've got very little insulation because they're made out of effectively two layers of boards. So there's a structural board plus a kind of outer layer of weatherboard. So the whole of that is about, let's say, 50, 60 millimeters thick, maybe not even that in some cases. And those boards are fixed to a timber frame, which is, depending on the size of the building, between 6x4 timbers up to timbers which may well be 12 inches, 300 millimeters square, depending, as I say, on the size of the building. But it seemed that there'll be an opportunity, as it were, to insulate some of these structures at roof level, to control daylight getting in, and also perhaps to insulate the walls as well, so as to prevent the heat from getting in to such a degree, therefore reducing the cooling load. And that would then reduce the requirement for electricity, which might mean that we could then remove a rather noisy power plant, electrical power station, which is within our site. I understand it's slated for removal at some point in the future in any case, and would form part of the more general desire to kind of reduce energy consumption. So there's kind of a whole series of interlocking things. And then if you do that, and then if you can have, let's say, consider the use of double glazing in some of the windows, perhaps. And if you've got a temperature difference between the exterior at 34 degrees, let's say, and an interior that you want to keep at 22, that's a 12-degree temperature difference, which is only the same as we have here when we want an interior temperature of about 22 degrees, and it's 10 degrees outside. It's kind of the same difference, and therefore the same benefit to be gained from using techniques to prevent heat loss in colder climates, can prevent heat gain in warmer ones. So this is sort of part of something we looked at, and we did a cost analysis to how much it might cost for an average sized house. And then it's kind of part of the general package of things which could be investigated moving forwards.
Just as a very final question, Francis, there's some more questions around policy and public involvement. So I just wonder whether, as a sort of final moment, you might be able to just sort of tell us about the next stages of the project.
Okay, well, the project was presented to the president. It was partly commissioned by them. So it was presented to the president in November, I think really is, in October, November 2024. And from that, there have been a number of sort of further policy developments. It was essentially forming part of a suite of documents which were being developed at the same time, which covered the creation of what they call a silica city, which effectively is a new suburb near the airport on previously undeveloped land, and other urban developments at the same time, looking at water supply more generally. And also looking at types of house that people would want to live in at a variety of different kind of socio-economic environments. So what we put here is essentially only one part of a larger suite of policy documents. which are being collated through the President's Office and also through the King's Foundation to look at a wider group of issues. In terms of where we go next, they've had a number of internal consultation through Parliament and the President's Office, and I'm afraid I don't know, in answer to I think somebody else's question about how and what specific engagement they then had with other parties as part of the overall picture. But there is, I think, the intention, firstly, to look at the main central market area, which is just to the south of our site. And we've been looking at that from a kind of condition standpoint and emergency repairs very recently. We were out there about 3 weeks ago, I think. And then after that, to look at the wider area around there too, again, with the intention of delivering benefits to the users of that part of the city. Because the one thing which we did feel is having essentially got to the point where we can make suggestions, we need to make sure that they are ideas which can be both afforded, and we did do a price analysis for a number of them, and which can be seen to fit into the wider policy initiatives that we were asked, that are being looked at by the other parties as well that I've also mentioned. I should mention too that at the same time they were developing some new historic building legislation in terms of protecting historic buildings and historic cityscapes and combining that with archaeological settings. So we were able to kind of review the emerging policy at the same time, and that's largely being drafted for that part by the National Trust for Guyana. And so we were able to sort of feed in some kind of comments sort of in two directions in what they're looking for from a policy point of view and how we can respond to that within our document, and ideas that we've had working with the team that we had and which can kind of then be transferred back into the emerging policy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Francis. I'm aware of the fact that we are at the end of time, so we do like to finish our lecture series on time. There are some other sort of questions that have been picked up there. So I think that sort of the message is that it would be great to have a follow-on talk, perhaps in our next lecture series, and we could find out about the next stages of the project in the different ways it's going to.
Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of interesting questions in the chat line, which I haven't obviously necessarily been able to answer all of.
But we will say thank you very much, Francis, and also thank you very much to our audience who've been able to join. I know that there are some good questions there, and Melinda, please do email the Commonwealth Heritage on that email address, and we can respond to some of those specifics that have been raised there as well. Okay.